I'm joined today by Terry Fitzpatrick, President and CEO of the Energy Association of Pennsylvania and former chair of the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. PJM Interconnection, who operates the electricity grid in 13 states, warned that there may not be enough electricity generating capacity by 2028 through 2030. Why weren't able to keep up with the supply and demand?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here and to talk about this important issue, Francine. Yes, PJM issued that report last year, and they warned, as you said, that they're worried that we don't have enough generation to make sure we can keep the lights on in just a few years. The reasons for that, there's a couple different things going on that are combining. Number one, after a long period where electricity demand was pretty flat, it is now going up. And that's because of electrification generally, the growth of electric vehicles. Also, data centers, you might have heard something about, to power artificial intelligence are cropping up around the country. And there's some being studied, in fact, in the Commonwealth. They use a lot of electricity. So demand is going up. At the same time, because of the way that states, and not so much Pennsylvania, but other states and the federal government are approaching climate change, it is having the effect of giving incentives and mandates favoring renewable energy, which is an intermittent technology. It operates when the wind blows and the sun shines. And it's discouraging, or in some cases, states such as Illinois have even passed legislation that has a timetable for closing all of the fossil fuel plants, both coal and natural gas, in the next 20 years. So when all those things together, what's happening is we have premature retirement of plants that can operate 24/7 around the clock. And those are really the workhorses of the grid. I mean, there's a place for renewable energy. They can certainly be part of the grid. But to keep the lights on, you really need that reliability value of those plants that can operate 24/7. They're closing too quickly. So when you look at where demand is going, supply is going, it looks like we could have that shortage or run a risk of a shortage in a few years.
Can you draw some more detailed comparisons of the sustainability and economics of these renewable energy resources that are generating power versus the traditional fossil fueled ones?
Right. Well, renewables, the biggest, all forms of energy, I like to say, have strengths and weaknesses. Now let's take coal, for example. Coal is very good in terms of reliability. Coal plants can operate around the clock. They're economical. The problem with coal is it emits a lot of carbon dioxide. Then take natural gas. Natural gas plants can operate around the clock too. They're very reliable. They also emit carbon dioxide, although only about half of the amount that coal does. Then you have renewables. Renewables do not have any directed emissions associated with them. But the big weakness they have, and that's a big strength, when you're trying to combat climate change, the weakness they have is that they're intermittent. They only produce power when the wind blows and when the sun is shining. You can't really run a system on only intermittent resources because we need power when we need it. The ability to store power is kind of limited right now. We do have batteries. There's progress being made on that technology, but they're still not able to. Renewables plus batteries do not provide the same reliability as these plants that can run around the clock. So that's the issue.
How do Pennsylvania's current renewable energy mandates compare to those that exist in other states?
They're more modest than many of the other states around us, although you really do see a red state, blue state divide when it comes to this, because a lot of the states, such as take New Jersey or again, Illinois, which is part of the regional grid, 13 states I think it is that PJM covers. Illinois has said they want to have 50% renewables by 2045, in addition to closing all the fossil fuel plants. Pennsylvania's requirements are really pretty modest compared to that. It's 8% of the total electricity that we use comes from renewables. There are some proposals in the legislature to increase that, but really our requirements are pretty modest compared to a lot of other states. There are some states, I think, like West Virginia and Ohio, that might have voluntary goals, but they don't have mandatory requirements there.
How much of the energy that Pennsylvania generates remains within the Commonwealth?
I don't have an exact percentage on that, but we are a very large exporter. In fact, I think we're the largest exporter of energy and electricity in the country. So we generate a lot more than we use right now. And that's similar, really. It really mirrors what the same situation with natural gas. Since the Marcellus Shale was developed, we're also a big exporter of natural gas. So, we meet our own needs, and we also meet the needs of really throughout the country, and particularly in the region around us for those fuels.
Now, you mentioned this briefly at the beginning of our discussion, but could you go in a little more detail of some of the responsible trends or reasons that our energy supply is diminishing?
Sure. And it's the big shift to renewables. That's part of it. Mm-hmm. I think it just is a matter of basic economics. When you take a certain technology and you put your thumb on the scale through government policy and favor it, when you give it subsidies, when you have mandates that favor it, there's a tendency over time, other competing technologies are going to look at that and say, this isn't a good market for us to be trying to compete in. These other technologies are getting the advantages and we aren't. So you see a tendency for the others to pull back because of that. And I think you've seen that a lot with renewable energy versus coal versus natural gas. And, one detail that's important here, I think, is the fact that with electricity, because of its complexities, what you see is that if you subsidize building renewable facilities, once they're built, once their capital costs are covered, they don't have any fuel costs to run. So that gives that there's something in PJM. There's two markets basically, that wholesale markets that PJM operates. So that retail suppliers of electricity, and that is utilities or competitive suppliers, because you as a customer, you can either buy your energy from your utility or from a competitive supplier. But when these retail suppliers, such as the utilities that I represent, when they buy power in the wholesale market, they've got to buy two things. They've got to buy something called capacity and energy. Now, energy is pretty easy to understand. You're buying the electricity, essentially. But you also have to pay generators for something called capacity. And that's a payment that's designed where they commit to be online and operating for a period of 3 years, and you're paying them to make sure that they're there. The reason you have a capacity market is because with electricity, unlike some other things, you do not want to have a shortage of electricity. So it's designed to make sure that those plants are there ahead of time so that they're ready to operate. The energy market is pretty much, as you would think from the name. Well, renewable power really can, once they're built, they have a big advantage in the energy market. So what we're seeing, part of this problem too, is the fact that once you subsidize them and they're online, it's hard for fossil fuel plants to compete with them in the energy market because you have to burn natural gas or you have to burn coal. So if you're thinking about building one of those plants, you got to look at this and say, well, I'm not going to make much money maybe in the energy market because we're subsidizing all of this renewable. I'm going to have to get all of my money from the capacity market in order really to make ends meet. Is that going to be enough? And then you have things like, for example, EPA just passed rules this year that say if you're a new natural gas plant, you have to sequester and bury the carbon dioxide, from that. That the industry is saying, the generation industry is saying, that is not ready commercially to go. And that's a very risky proposition. So there's another reason why somebody might not build a new natural gas-fired power plant. So all of those are some of the dynamics. I know that's kind of complicated, a long answer, but all of those things are going into contributing to this problem.
What policies would you support to increase energy production?
Well, I think the first thing, and I wrote an op-ed on this that was published recently, I think there's basically two things. First of all, it's a very difficult problem for Pennsylvania lawmakers to address because, we've relied on markets for the last over 20 years to build enough power plants to supply us. That has worked pretty well, for most of that time period. We've built a lot of natural gas plants, but now because of the cumulative effect of all of these climate policies, I think that's the big thing. Now nobody's coming forward to build plants that operate 24/7. But Pennsylvania didn't really do that. Pennsylvania lawmakers, though, can't change the basic dynamics of what's going on with other states, with the federal government. So what are we going to do about this? I think, unfortunately, it's going to be necessary for the legislature to consider some form of new policy, and there's probably different ways to do this, that are going to provide some support to the plants that operate 24/7. Because all of the advantages are being given to renewables, you're going to need, government's put its thumb on the scale to do that. It's maybe going to have to put its thumb on the scale again to make sure that we have the power plants that we really need to keep the lights on. Now, that is going to be a really heavy lift. That is a big policy change, because I was involved in the restructuring of the electricity market back in the 1990s. There's going to have to be modifications or an overhaul made to that if we're going to intervene in the market to help these other types of plants. And I know there's going to be a lot of debate required. But the other thing I would say is, while that's being considered, at least I think the General Assembly ought to take a really hard look at any legislation involving energy that could make the problem worse. And I think one of the things that contributes to that is if we increase renewable energy mandates, I think that contributes to the problem. Something like, I know there's been a lot of controversy over whether there should be a cap and trade program for greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. The governor has supported that type of plan. But for plants operating in Pennsylvania, that is going to be another headwind that they have to face if that is put in place, because they're going to be competing against power plants in other states that don't have to meet that requirement. So all of those things, I think, need to be looked at because of this problem.
If other states have more stringent renewable policies, how does that affect Pennsylvania financially?
Well, the effect would be, if that leads to an electric reliability problem and we don't have enough power to keep the lights on, that's a problem for us. That would affect our economy. But, one of the things I'm talking about here is the possibility that we might have to support plants that operate 24/7. There's a cost associated with doing that. One of the hard things about this is going to be, if we do that in Pennsylvania, we're bearing a cost to keep electricity reliable, not just for ourselves, but for all the states that are around us that are contributing to the problem. So you can see this is a very thorny problem, but we're just trying to get folks to really focus on it, and let's try to come up with the best solution that we can.
As you talk about legislative initiatives, last month lawmakers discussed a plan called Pennsylvania Reliable Energy Sustainability Standard,
right,
which would require 35% of Pennsylvania's electric supply to be clean energy by 2035. What's the Energy Association of Pennsylvania doing to educate lawmakers about the potential effects of this?
Well, we're doing a number of things. I think the op-ed that I referred to, is part of that. We were not asked to testify on that, so we haven't weighed in specifically on that. But we've been involved with renewable energy initiatives over the years in legislation, and we've been trying to spread this word. I think with the PJM report last year and with this problem getting closer, I think we'll probably have to step up our efforts on that. And but it's very difficult because people are concerned about climate change, and the question is, what's the best way to address that? We're saying, let's be careful, let's be pragmatic, because we don't think we can run our system on just renewable energy. One of the things that we like to say, one of our basic messages is this: when it comes to energy policy, there's three things you need to pay attention to: affordability, reliability, and environmental sustainability. Now, there's tension between all of those things. If you emphasize one of those to the exclusion of the others, you're going to run into problems. And that's what we think. We're emphasizing reliability because we think that's the thing that's in most danger right now.
What happens to traditional fossil fuel-powered electricity plants when higher environmental renewable energy standards are imposed?
Well, it's pushing them to retire prematurely. And, we saw an example of that in the last couple years, I think it is, where a very big coal-fired power plant, Homer City in Indiana County, Pennsylvania, closed because of the cumulative weight of all of this. Now, some of this, too, is the fact that coal plants have had to compete with all this cheap natural gas. I mean, that has contributed to it as well. But that's the kind of thing, these plants have to close down. And that's there's a loss of jobs as a result of that. It affects the local economy. It's very difficult. There's a possibility those sites could be reused. In fact, I was reading about a utility, I think, in another state that's thinking about closing its coal plant, and it said it's going to build a nuclear plant on the same side, which we haven't talked about nuclear at all. Nuclear is great, no emissions. Once it's built, they run great, very expensive to build, very expensive to build. That's the big drawback there.
What happens to fossil fuel-powered energy plants if they're unable to meet the imposed standards? Are they penalized?
Well, they can be penalized if they're operating and not meeting the standards. But if they see standards they don't think economically they're going to be able to meet, that's when they just decide to close down. Now, a good example of this is in Maryland. There's a coal-fired power plant in the Baltimore area called Brandon Shores that proposed to close down. I think it's owned by Talon Energy. When they did that, PJM, which is responsible for reliability on the grid, looked at that and say, we're not going to be able to keep the lights on in Baltimore if that plant closes down because there's not enough generation there, or there's not enough transmission to get power from other places into Baltimore. So they signed what's called a reliability must-run contract with Talon Energy to keep Brandon Shores operating for at least another year, 2, maybe 3, because without that, you're not going to be able to keep the lights on. And they're paying them an out-of-market rate that's higher to keep them on board. So that's an example of what can happen to try to keep plants like that operating for at least a short time until another fix can be made to keep power running.
If we can go on a brief tangent, something
Sure.
that you'd mentioned just a moment ago, alongside the state budget's passage, Governor Shapiro signed a bill that creates a framework for carbon capture technology. Can you just explain maybe just a thumbnail sketch of what carbon capture technology is, how it works, and the impact that may have?
It's basically it's a technology that removes the carbon dioxide in the process of burning a fuel. Then it has to be transported through a system of pipelines to a site where it's buried and sequestered, as is the term, underground. Similar maybe in some respects, natural gas, and we represent natural gas utilities as well, but there's storage facilities for natural gas where it is kept underground until such time as it's pulled out to be used. So this would be something kind of similar to that for carbon dioxide, where it would be transported through a system of pipelines and sequestered. Now, we might have the geology to do that pretty well in Pennsylvania. I think that was a very good development that legislation was passed. That doesn't mean it's quite commercially viable to do that yet. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and investors have to be willing to step up, and put the money into that. So they're going to have to be assured that they know what the rules of the road are, and that they're going to be able to make money doing that over a period of probably decades.
Perhaps just on a broader scope, can you talk briefly to the impact the energy industry has overall on the economic climate of Pennsylvania?
Pennsylvania is an energy powerhouse. And it's become much more so since the Marcellus Shale was developed probably in the last 15 years. We're the #2 natural gas producing state in the country. I think we're the 4th largest electricity producer. And the leading I think we export more total energy than any other state in the country. So it's very big in terms of employment here. Use of energy is very important to all of our industries. It's important to jobs here. So it's really critical. And other than Texas, we're probably the #1 energy state in the country.
From a clearly economic standpoint, is there a benefit to investing in clean energy compared to further supporting our traditional fossil fuel-powered energy plants?
Well, and that goes to the government subsidies and mandates that are out there. They've been around for quite a while. I think the Inflation Reduction Act has additional incentives for people to do things like put rooftop solar, on their homes, and for some of the other technologies too. So, that's certainly part of what's at play here in the issues.
Is government intervention necessary to help support and sustain our energy supply, or do you think the market can right itself?
Well, I don't think the market can right itself unless government is willing to step back and let it operate. When it comes to climate change policy, I think unlike other pollution problems, with most other pollution problems, say acid rain, for example, we've regulated pollution. And, all of the electricity generators had to meet those requirements. It didn't stop the market from operating. But when it comes to climate policy, rather than do that, there has been a tendency to subsidize and to mandate and to approach it that way. And that's made it very difficult for the technologies which aren't benefiting from the mandates and subsidies to keep in operation.
As the legislature returns in mid-September, what role will the Energy Association have in furthering this discussion?
Well, we're trying to put this issue on the front burner. We're trying to draw attention to it because we think it's something that has to be studied. There have been some legislative hearings already. In fact, the state Senate has held some hearings, and they've done it in conjunction with the Ohio General Assembly. And I think that's the type of effort that I think we need to see, because this is a problem that affects Pennsylvania. Yes, it's true. But it affects all of the states in the region. So, that's the kind of thing that we would like to see. They've talked about the problem, I think, to this point. I think we need to sort of pivot a little bit and say, okay, what can we do about this? What's the range of solutions that's out there? What's the best solution, for all of the people in Pennsylvania?
Terry Fitzpatrick serves as President and CEO of the Energy Association of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.